Picture this, ladies. It's December 23rd, and most families are wrapping presents and baking cookies. But not mine. My stepfather, Michael, was loading my belongings into black trash bags while his new wife, Rebecca, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching like she was supervising the removal of unwanted furniture. I was 11 years old, and I still believed that Christmas miracles were real. I kept thinking this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that Michael would suddenly remember he loved me, that Rebecca would have a change of heart. But as we drove through the snowy streets of Portland, Oregon, past houses glowing with warm lights and families gathered around dinner tables, I realized this wasn't a Christmas story with a happy ending. You see, my biological father had died when I was 3, a heart attack at 32 that left my mother devastated. She struggled for years, working double shifts as a nurse just to keep us afloat in our tiny apartment. When I was 9, she met Michael at the hospital where she worked. He was a successful insurance broker, divorced, lonely, and he seemed genuinely interested in taking care of both of us. For 2 years, it felt like we had finally found our fairy tale. Michael would take me to baseball games, help with homework, and even taught me how to ride a bike in the parking lot behind our apartment complex. When he proposed to my mother, I was so excited I could barely contain myself. Finally, we would be a real family. But life has a cruel way of rewriting your story when you least expect it. My mother died in a car accident just 6 months after their wedding. One moment she was driving home from her shift at the hospital, and the next, a drunk driver had stolen everything that mattered to me. I remember sitting in the funeral home, holding Michael's hand, believing that even though we'd lost her, we still had each other. That belief lasted exactly 18 months. Rebecca entered the picture like a tornado, sweeping away every trace of the life my mother and I had built. She was younger than my mother, blonde where Mom had been brunette, sharp where Mom had been soft. She worked in marketing at a tech company and had very specific ideas about the kind of life she wanted. And that life didn't include a grieving 11-year-old who reminded her new husband of his previous marriage. The changes started slowly. Family photos that included my mother mysteriously disappeared from the mantelpiece. My mother's favorite coffee mug got accidentally broken. Rebecca redid the guest room that had been my mother's craft space, erasing every trace of her presence. When I protested, Michael would pat my shoulder and say, "We need to let Rebecca make this house her home too, sweetie. Your mum would understand." But I knew my mother wouldn't understand. She would have fought for me, protected me, made sure I felt safe and loved. Rebecca, on the other hand, saw me as a complication in her perfect narrative. The final straw came when Rebecca announced she was pregnant. Suddenly, there wasn't room in their future for someone else's child, as she so delicately put it. The conversations happened behind closed doors, but kids hear everything. I heard her crying about how she couldn't bond with the baby while that girl was around, as a constant reminder of Michael's past. I heard her ultimatum. Choose between his new family and me. And he chose her. The ride to the homeless shelter was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Michael kept clearing his throat like he was going to say something meaningful, some explanation that would make this all make sense. Instead, he turned up the Christmas music, Silent Night playing on the radio, as if the universe was mocking us both. "This is just temporary, Sophia," he finally said as we pulled up to the grey concrete building with its chipped paint and broken sign. "Rebecca just needs time to adjust to being a new mother. Once the baby comes and she settles in, we'll figure something out." I wanted to believe him so badly that I nodded and said, "Okay, Michael, I understand." But even as an 11-year-old, I recognized the lie in his voice, the way he wouldn't look at me when he spoke. The intake worker at Mercy House Shelter was a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Rodriguez who had kind eyes, but had clearly seen too much. She looked at Michael with barely concealed disgust as he explained that this was temporary and that he was going through a difficult transition, and that I was a good kid who just needed somewhere safe to stay. "And you can't provide that safety?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked pointedly. Michael's face reddened. "It's complicated. My wife is pregnant and we're having some adjustments." "I see." Mrs. Rodriguez said in a tone that suggested she saw this exact scenario far too often. She turned to me with a gentle smile. Sophia, honey, would you like to see where you'll be staying? I remember looking back at Michael one more time, hoping he would change his mind, hoping he would say this was all a mistake. Instead, he was already heading for the door, my bags of belongings sitting on the intake desk, like evidence of how easily a child could be discarded. I'll call you soon, he said without turning around. We'll figure this out. That was December 23rd, 2009. The call never came. Christmas morning at Mercy House was nothing like the Christmases I'd known with my mother, where she would wake me up early with hot chocolate and we'd open our modest gifts together while watching the parade on TV. Here, Christmas was a community meal served on paper plates, with donated toys that had seen better days and volunteers who meant well but couldn't hide their pity. I spent that first week convinced that Michael would come back. Every time the phone rang or someone new walked through the front door, my heart would race thinking it was him. I created elaborate explanations in my head. Rebecca had gone into early labor, and he couldn't leave her side. Or there had been a family emergency. Or maybe he was planning a surprise where he'd whisk me away to our new home as a family. But as January turned into February, and February melted into March, the truth became impossible to ignore. Michael wasn't coming back because he didn't want to come back. I had been replaced before I was even gone. The other kids at the shelter tried to prepare me for this reality. There was Marcus, a 13-year-old who'd been there for 8 months after his grandmother died, and Aisha, a 15-year-old whose mother was in rehab for the 3rd time. They'd seen new kids come and go, watched them cling to hope until it became too painful to hold on to. The sooner you stop waiting, the sooner you can start living, Aisha told me one evening as we did homework together at the communal table. Whoever left you here? They're not losing sleep over it, so why should you? But I wasn't ready to give up. I found ways to contact Michael, calling his office until his secretary, Janet, gently told me that Mr. Patterson had requested I be removed from his approved caller list. I sent letters to his home address, carefully written notes telling him about my grades, about how good I was being, about how much I missed him and Rebecca and hoped they were happy with their new baby. The letters came back unopened with "Return to sender" stamped across my childish handwriting. That's when I started haunting the public library. The Multnomah County Library became my sanctuary. It was warm, quiet, and filled with worlds I could escape to when reality became too much to bear. I'd spend hours reading everything I could get my hands on, fiction that transported me to magical places, biographies of people who'd overcome impossible circumstances, and eventually, textbooks that challenged my mind in ways school never had. It was there that I met Ms. Eleanor Chen, the head librarian who would become my guardian angel. She never asked invasive questions about why an 11-year-old was spending every day after school and all weekend at the library. She simply started leaving small brown bags at my usual table, sandwiches, fruit, sometimes a thermos of soup on cold days. Brain food, she'd say with a wink when I'd try to thank her. Can't have my best reader fainting from hunger. Ms. Chen was in her 60s, a former teacher who had never married but had devoted her life to helping kids like me. She had an uncanny ability to sense what each child needed. Sometimes it was a book recommendation, sometimes a quiet place to cry, and sometimes just someone who believed they were worth saving. As the months passed, I aged out of the children's section of the shelter and into the harder realities of being a teenager with no family. Social workers tried to place me in foster homes, but I kept running back to Mercy House. At least there I knew what to expect. Foster families were wild cards, some genuinely caring, others just collecting checks, and a few that were dangerous in ways the system couldn't always detect. "Why do you keep coming back here?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez during one of our mandatory check-ins. "The Hendersons are good people. They want to help you." How could I explain that staying at Mercy House felt like maintaining some connection to the hope that Michael might still come back? That leaving felt like admitting he had really abandoned me. Instead, I just shrugged and said, "I like it here. It feels safe." Mrs. Rodriguez studied my face with the wisdom of someone who'd worked with abandoned children for decades. "Sophia, honey, sometimes we hold on to the wrong things because letting go feels like losing ourselves. But staying stuck isn't living. She was right, of course, but 11-year-old girls aren't known for their emotional maturity. It would take me 2 more years to truly understand what she meant. The turning point came just before my 14th birthday. I was walking past Michael and Rebecca's neighborhood, something I'd done hundreds of times, always hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to maybe run into him at the grocery store or gas station nearby. This time I saw him in the front yard teaching a little boy who looked exactly like him how to throw a football. The boy was about 4 years old, with Michael's dark hair and easy smile. He was laughing as Michael cheered his wobbly throws, calling him Champ and Buddy, all the nicknames he'd once used with me. Rebecca came out of the house carrying lemonade, looking beautiful and content in a sundress that showed her flat stomach, fully recovered from pregnancy. They looked like a perfect family, complete, happy, as if I had never existed at all. That night, I sat in the shelter's common room and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. If Michael could so easily erase me from his story, then I would write my own. I would become someone so remarkable, so successful, so absolutely undeniable that every day he looked in the mirror, he would remember what he'd thrown away. I was going to become a doctor. The decision to become a doctor might sound noble, but I'll be honest with you. It started from a place of pure spite. I wanted to prove that the little girl Michael dumped at a homeless shelter could become someone he'd be forced to respect, maybe even regret losing. But spite, as it turns out, is an incredible motivator. I threw myself into my studies with a ferocity that worried the shelter staff. While other kids were watching TV or playing video games, I was buried in textbooks that Ms. Chen had somehow acquired for me. She never explained how a small public library kept obtaining college-level medical texts, but I suspected she was spending her own money to feed my academic hunger. "Sophia," she said one afternoon as I struggled through an anatomy book meant for college sophomores, "what draws you to medicine?" I looked up from a diagram of the cardiovascular system, my notebook filled with careful sketches and color-coded notes. "I want to help people who've been hurt," I said, which was true but only part of the truth. The rest, the part about showing Michael what he'd lost, felt too petty to voice. Ms. Chen nodded knowingly. "The best doctors are often people who've experienced healing themselves, whether physical or emotional. Your pain could become your superpower if you let it." At 15, I took my first real job washing dishes at Rosario's, a family-owned Italian restaurant near the library. The work was hot, thankless, and paid minimum wage, but it was mine. Every paycheck went into a savings account I'd opened with Ms. Chen's help, every penny carefully hoarded for my future. The other dishwashers thought I was crazy for spending my breaks reading medical journals instead of checking social media or complaining about customers. Carlos, a kind man in his 50s who'd been washing dishes for 20 years, would shake his head as he watched me highlighting passages in a biochemistry textbook. "Mija," he'd say, "you know you don't have to prove anything to anybody, right? You're already enough just as you are." But being enough had never been the problem. Michael had abandoned me not because I wasn't good enough, but because Rebecca wanted a clean slate for their new family. I had been collateral damage in someone else's happiness. The only way to ensure that never happened again was to become undeniably valuable, the kind of person who couldn't be easily discarded. I studied for my GED while other kids my age were worried about prom dates and college applications. The night before the test, I sat in the shelter's quiet room, surrounded by practice books and old exams, fighting down the familiar panic that whispered, I wasn't smart enough, wasn't worthy of the dreams I was chasing. Ms. Chen found me there at midnight, stress-eating vending machine cookies and second-guessing everything I'd learned. "What if I fail?" I asked her, the fear finally spilling out. "What if I'm not actually smart enough for medical school? What if I'm just fooling myself?" She sat down beside me, her presence instantly calming. "Sophia, I've worked with thousands of students over the years. I've seen naturally gifted kids who never reached their potential because they lacked drive. And I've seen average students achieve extraordinary things through pure determination. You have both gifts, intelligence and a work ethic that's honestly a little frightening. But what if it's not enough? Then you'll figure out another path. But failing at this doesn't make you a failure as a person. You've already survived more than most adults ever will. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're going to be okay. I passed the GED with scores high enough to earn scholarship offers from 3 community colleges. Portland Community College offered me a full academic scholarship, plus a work-study position in their tutoring center. For the first time since my mother died, I felt like the universe might actually be rooting for me. Community college was a revelation. My professors didn't see a homeless kid or a charity case. They saw a serious student who asked thoughtful questions and turned in meticulously researched papers. Dr. Martinez, my organic chemistry professor, pulled me aside after class one day to suggest I consider applying to 4-year universities as a junior transfer student. "Have you thought about Oregon State?" she asked. "Their pre-med program is excellent, and they have generous financial aid for students with your background." Background. Such a polite way to say tragic life story that makes admissions committees feel sympathetic. I spent that evening researching Oregon State University, reading about their medical school acceptance rates, their research opportunities, the professors who might become my mentors. For the first time, medical school felt like a real possibility rather than an impossible dream. The application process was emotionally brutal. Essay prompts asked about family support systems I didn't have, leadership experiences I'd never been able to pursue, extracurricular activities that required time and money I hadn't possessed. But they also asked about overcoming adversity, about what shaped my desire to become a doctor, about how my background would contribute to the medical profession. Those essays I could write. I wrote about learning to suture wounds on stuffed animals with donated sewing supplies because I couldn't afford medical school prep courses. I wrote about diagnosing medical conditions in shelter residents who couldn't afford healthcare, using knowledge gleaned from textbooks and online medical resources. I wrote about understanding that medicine isn't just about treating disease, but about seeing the humanity in people whom society has overlooked. The admissions committee at Oregon State didn't just accept me, they offered me a full scholarship plus a living stipend that would allow me to quit my dishwashing job and focus entirely on academics. When the acceptance letter arrived at Mercy House, Mrs. Rodriguez cried harder than I did. "Sophia," she said, "in 30 years of social work, I've never seen a kid transform their life so completely. Your mother would be so proud." That night, I called Ms. Chen to share the news. Her voice was thick with emotion as she said, "I always knew you were destined for great things, sweetheart. But more than that, I knew you had the strength to reach them." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," I told her. "You saved my life." "No, honey," she said softly. "You saved your own life. I just provided some snacks along the way." As I packed my few belongings for the move to Corvallis, I found myself thinking about Michael for the first time in months. By now, his son would be about 7 years old, probably playing Little League and learning to ride a bike. Rebecca would be perfectly settled into her role as devoted mother and wife. Their life would be complete and comfortable, unmarked by the messiness of caring for someone else's child. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever wondered how I was doing or whether I'd survived the abandonment he'd chosen. Part of me hoped he'd somehow hear about my acceptance to Oregon State, that someone would mention seeing his former stepdaughter's name in a newspaper article about scholarship recipients or academic achievers. But mostly, I was learning to live without needing his validation. Success for its own sake felt better than success as revenge, and that shift in motivation would make all the difference in the years to come. Oregon State University was like stepping into a different world, one where people my age worried about typical college problems like choosing a major or deciding which sorority to rush. Meanwhile, I was 21 years old, had been supporting myself for 6 years, and possessed a focused intensity that both impressed and intimidated my classmates. Pre-med coursework was brutal but manageable. I'd been preparing for this level of academic rigor my entire teenage years, studying with a desperation that came from knowing education was my only path to security. While my classmates complained about organic chemistry, I found it beautiful. A logical system where inputs created predictable outputs, where understanding the rules guaranteed success. What I hadn't prepared for was how lonely it would feel to be surrounded by people who'd never experienced real hardship. My study group partners would casually mention spring break trips to Mexico or summer internships their parents had arranged through professional connections. They complained about dorm food while I silently marveled at having unlimited access to meals. They stressed about impressing their families with good grades while I had no family to impress at all. Dr. Sarah Kim, my biochemistry professor, noticed my isolation during my sophomore year. She'd observe how I'd arrive early to every class, sit alone, and leave immediately afterward, while other students chatted and made social plans. "Sophia," she said after class one day, "would you be interested in joining my research team? We're studying cardiac regeneration at the cellular level. It's unpaid, but you'd get experience with laboratory techniques and possibly co-authorship on published papers." Research work became my social life. The lab was populated by graduate students and postdocs who were focused, driven, and understood that science required sacrifice. Dr. Kim became not just a mentor, but a surrogate mother figure who checked in on my mental health as carefully as she monitored my academic progress. "You know," she told me during one of our late-night lab sessions, "brilliance without balance leads to burnout. Even the most dedicated doctors need human connections outside of medicine." She was right, but I didn't know how to form those connections. My upbringing had taught me to be self-reliant, to never depend on others for emotional or practical support. The idea of vulnerability felt dangerous, like handing someone ammunition they could use to hurt me later. That's why meeting David Rodriguez felt so unexpected. I was in my junior year, working a weekend shift at the campus medical clinic, where I'd earned a work-study position. Most students came in with hangovers, sports injuries, or STD scares, routine issues that allowed me to practice basic diagnostic skills while earning money for living expenses. David arrived on a Saturday morning with his 8-year-old nephew, Tommy, who'd fallen off his bike and scraped his knee badly enough to need professional cleaning and bandaging. David was 26, a graduate student in environmental engineering, and had been babysitting Tommy when the accident happened. "I'm probably overreacting," he said anxiously as I examined the wound, "but his sister will kill me if I don't take proper care of him. Plus, it looks pretty deep, and I didn't want to risk infection." I cleaned the scrape carefully while David distracted Tommy with terrible jokes about engineers who were afraid of bandages. What struck me wasn't just that David was handsome, tall with kind brown eyes and an easy smile, but that he was genuinely worried about this child who wasn't even his own son. He asked thoughtful questions about wound care, took careful notes about changing the dressing, and thanked me as if I'd performed surgery instead of basic first aid. "Can I ask you something?" he said as I finished wrapping Tommy's knee. "Are you actually a nursing student, or are you going to medical school? Because you handled that like someone who's planning to be a doctor." "Pre-med," I confirmed. "Planning to apply to medical schools next year." "That's amazing. What kind of medicine interests you?" It was such a simple question, but nobody had ever asked me about my specific medical interests. People usually focused on the remarkable story of how I'd overcome homelessness to reach college, treating my medical ambitions as some kind of inspiring fairy tale rather than a serious career choice. "Neurology," I said. "I'm fascinated by how the brain processes trauma and heals from injury, both physical trauma and emotional trauma." David nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I imagine you understand healing in ways that most people don't." Something about the way he said it, without pity, without treating me like a case study, made me want to keep talking to him. When he asked if I'd be interested in getting coffee sometime to discuss our respective graduate school experiences, I surprised myself by saying yes. Our first date lasted 6 hours. We started at a coffee shop near campus and ended up walking through Riverfront Park, talking about everything from our career goals to our childhood experiences with loss. David had lost his father to cancer when he was 15, and while his family situation was completely different from mine, loving mother, supportive siblings, stable home, he understood grief and the way it shapes your relationship with the world. "I think loss makes some people more compassionate and others more guarded," he said as we sat by the river watching ducks paddle against the current. "You seem like someone who chose compassion despite having every reason to choose protection." I'm probably more guarded than you realize, I admitted. I don't trust easily. That's not being guarded. That's being intelligent. Trust should be earned, not given away freely. Over the following months, David proved he could be trusted with small vulnerabilities before I shared larger ones. He remembered details about my research projects and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. He brought me soup when I was sick, even though I insisted I could take care of myself. He introduced me to his family without making a big deal about my lack of relatives, simply including me in gatherings as naturally as breathing. His mother, Carmen Rodriguez, was a high school counselor who had devoted her career to helping at-risk teenagers. She recognized something familiar in me during our first meeting and pulled David aside afterward. "That girl has been through more than she's telling you," she said gently. "Be patient with her. People who've learned to survive alone don't easily learn to live with others." David shared this conversation with me months later, after we'd moved in together and I was applying to medical schools. "She wasn't warning me away from you," he explained. "She was helping me understand how to love you better." Medical school applications required letters of recommendation, transcripts, MCAT scores, and personal statements that would distinguish me from thousands of other high-achieving applicants. But they also required listing emergency contacts and family information, sections that highlighted how alone I really was. Dr. Kim wrote one of my recommendation letters focusing on my research abilities and dedication. Ms. Chen wrote another, describing my intellectual curiosity and resilience. For my third letter, I asked David's mother Carmen, who had become a mentor figure during my relationship with her son. "I'm honored you asked," she said, "but are you sure you want a recommendation from someone who's known you for less than 2 years?" "You know me better than most people who've been in my life longer," I told her. "You see me as a person, not as a story or a project or a charity case." The letter Carmen wrote was beautiful. She focused on my emotional intelligence, my ability to connect with people from difficult backgrounds, and my potential to bring empathy and understanding to medicine. She wrote about observing me with David's younger cousins, how naturally I connected with children who were shy or struggling, how I seemed to understand instinctively what they needed to feel safe. When acceptance letters started arriving, David was more excited than I was. Oregon Health and Science University offered me admission with a partial scholarship. UC San Francisco offered a full scholarship, plus a research assistantship. Harvard offered admission, but limited financial aid. UCSF, David said immediately when I showed him the options. Full scholarship, amazing research opportunities, and San Francisco is only an hour's flight from Portland. You could still visit Ms. Chen regularly, but I was drawn to Harvard despite the financial challenges. It represented the ultimate validation. The homeless girl who'd been abandoned at 11, now accepted to the most prestigious medical school in the country. It felt like the final proof that Michael's abandonment hadn't defined my worth or limited my potential. "What's really driving this decision?" Dr. Kim asked during one of our lab meetings. "Is it about getting the best medical education, or is it about proving something to people who aren't even part of your life anymore?" Her question forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. After 8 years of academic success, I was still that 11-year-old girl trying to prove she was worthy of love and commitment. Choosing Harvard would mean taking on massive debt to attend a school primarily because of its prestige, not because it would make me a better doctor. That night, I called Ms. Chen to discuss my options. Her wisdom, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Sophia," she said, "you've spent years building an impressive life. Now you need to decide whether you're building it for yourself or for people who chose not to be part of it." I chose UCSF. The full scholarship meant I could focus on learning instead of financial survival, and the research opportunities aligned perfectly with my interest in neurology and trauma medicine. Most importantly, it felt like a choice made from confidence rather than insecurity. Moving to San Francisco with David felt like the first decision I'd ever made purely for happiness rather than necessity. We found a small apartment near the campus, and David transferred to UC Berkeley's environmental engineering program. For the first time in my life, I was building a future based on love and partnership rather than spite and survival. Medical school was everything I'd expected. Exhausting, competitive, intellectually demanding, and absolutely thrilling. But it was also lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. My classmates came from families of doctors, lawyers, and academics. They spoke casually about medical practices their parents owned or research their families funded. During breaks, they went home to family gatherings and weddings and celebrations that reminded them they were loved and supported. I went home to David, which was wonderful, but I also went home to silence about my past, to questions I couldn't answer about my family, to a persistent feeling that I was pretending to belong in a world that wasn't meant for people like me. It was during my second year of medical school, while studying for pathology exams, that David proposed. David's proposal happened on the most ordinary Tuesday evening, which somehow made it perfect. I was hunched over my laptop at our tiny kitchen table, surrounded by medical textbooks and empty coffee cups, studying for my pathology final. He came home from his lab with takeout Thai food and found me muttering anatomical terms under my breath like incantations. "Sophia," he said, setting down the food containers, "I need to ask you something." "Can it wait?" "I'm trying to memorize the stages of inflammatory response, and if I stop now, I'll lose everything." "It's important." Something in his tone made me look up. He was standing there holding a small velvet box, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen before. David was confident, steady, the kind of person who approached challenges with careful planning rather than anxiety. "I know your relationship with traditional family structures is complicated," he began, "and I know you value your independence above almost everything else. But I also know that you love me, and I love you, and we've been building something together that feels like the family you never had." I stared at the ring box, my mind racing. Marriage had always felt like a luxury for people with stable backgrounds, not something within reach for women like me. I'd watched too many foster kids age out of the system and immediately get pregnant or married as desperate attempts to create the families they'd never had, only to repeat cycles of instability and abandonment. "I'm not asking you to become someone different," David continued. "I'm asking if you want to make official what we've already built. A partnership based on choice, not need. A family based on love, not obligation." The ring was simple, elegant, and clearly chosen by someone who understood that I wouldn't want anything flashy or traditional. When I tried it on, it fit perfectly, as if David had somehow figured out my ring size without my knowledge. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "About 6 months. I wanted to wait until you were settled in medical school, until we both knew this was sustainable long term." "And you're sure? Because I'm going to be a doctor, which means crazy hours and emotional stress and probably not much time for traditional wife activities." David laughed. "Sophia, I fell in love with your ambition, not despite it. I want to be married to Dr. Rodriguez, not to some version of you that gave up her dreams for domestic perfection." We married the following summer in a small ceremony at the Portland Japanese Garden, with Ms. Chen and David's family as our only guests. Carmen Rodriguez became the mother I'd never had, embracing me not with pity for my past, but with excitement for my future. David's siblings treated me like I'd always been part of their family, including me in inside jokes and childhood stories that gradually helped me understand how functional families operated. Medical school became more manageable with David's support. He celebrated my successes, helped me process difficult cases, and provided emotional stability that allowed me to focus entirely on learning. When I started my clinical rotations during third year, he adjusted his schedule to accommodate my unpredictable hours, never making me feel guilty about missed dinners or cancelled plans. My neurology rotation confirmed everything I'd suspected about my calling. Working with stroke patients, trauma survivors, and people recovering from brain injuries felt like coming home. I understood their frustration with bodies that no longer cooperated, their grief for the people they'd been before injury, their determination to rebuild their lives from whatever remained intact. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of neurology at UCSF, became my most important mentor. She was a black woman who'd grown up in Oakland, worked her way through medical school on scholarships and loans, and built a reputation as one of the most compassionate and skilled neurologists on the West Coast. "You have excellent technical skills," she told me during my rotation evaluation. "But more importantly, you have the emotional intelligence to help people navigate the psychological trauma that often accompanies neurological injury. Have you considered specializing in neurological rehabilitation?" Under Dr. Williams' guidance, I spent my 4th year focusing on rehabilitation medicine, learning how to help patients rebuild their lives after devastating injuries. The work was challenging but incredibly rewarding, teaching stroke survivors to speak again, helping accident victims regain motor functions, supporting families through the long process of neurological recovery. I matched into UCSF's neurology residency program, which meant 5 more years of training, but also 5 more years working with Dr. Williams and building expertise in the field I was passionate about. David's environmental engineering PhD would take about the same amount of time, so we planned to stay in San Francisco until we were both finished with our advanced training. Life felt stable, purposeful, and happy in ways I'd never imagined possible. That's when I learned that happiness doesn't protect you from the past, coming back to destroy your peace. The call came on a Thursday evening during my 2nd year of residency. I was at the hospital finishing up a 36-hour shift, exhausted but satisfied after successfully managing a complex case involving a teenage car accident victim. My phone rang as I was changing out of scrubs, displaying a number I didn't recognize but with a familiar area code: Portland, Oregon. "Hello, is this Dr. Sophia Martinez?" The voice was professional, crisp, clearly medical. "Yes, this is Dr. Martinez. This is Dr. Jennifer Huang from Portland General Hospital. I'm calling because we have a patient who listed you as his emergency contact, Michael Patterson. He's in acute kidney failure and needs immediate medical attention." The world tilted. I sat down heavily on the bench in the locker room, my vision blurring as 8 years of carefully constructed emotional stability cracked open. "I'm sorry," I managed. "There must be some mistake. I don't know anyone by that name." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Michael Patterson, not the Michael Rodriguez I'd taken David's name to become, but Michael Patterson, the man who'd abandoned me at Mercy House on Christmas Eve when I was 11 years old. "Dr. Martinez, I understand this might be complicated, but Mr. Patterson is very sick. His kidneys are failing, and he needs dialysis immediately. He's also a candidate for transplant, but we need to contact his family to discuss options." "What happened to his wife, Rebecca? Don't they have a son?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Patterson filed for divorce 6 months ago. Their son is 16, but he's not a compatible donor match." "Mr. Patterson specifically asked us to contact you. He said you were his daughter." Daughter. After 8 years of silence, of being erased from his life so completely that I'd learned to think of myself as someone who'd never had a father, he was claiming me as his daughter when he needed something I could provide. "Dr. Martinez, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. What exactly are you asking me to do?" "We'd like you to come in for testing to see if you're a compatible kidney donor. If you are, we can discuss transplant options. Mr. Patterson's condition is quite serious. Without intervention, he has perhaps 6 months to live." I hung up without giving an answer, then sat in that locker room for 20 minutes, shaking with anger and disbelief. 8 years of building a life without him, of learning to see myself as worthy despite his abandonment, and now he had the audacity to claim me as family when he needed me to save his life. When I finally made it home, David took one look at my face and poured me a glass of wine without asking questions. I told him everything. About Michael, about the shelter, about the way I'd been discarded, and the way that experience had shaped everything about who I'd become. "So what are you going to do?" he asked after I'd finished the whole story. "Nothing," I said immediately. "He made his choice 8 years ago. I'm not his family, I'm not his daughter, and I'm not responsible for saving him." David nodded slowly. "That's completely understandable. You don't owe him anything." "But—" "No buts. I support whatever decision you make. I just want to make sure you're making it for the right reasons." That night, I called Ms. Chen and told her about the call from Portland General. Her response was immediate and fierce. "That man has some nerve," she said. After abandoning you, after letting you struggle and survive on your own, he has the audacity to contact you only when he needs something. You owe him nothing, Sophia. Nothing. But something was nagging at me, a question I couldn't quite articulate. Over the next few days, I found myself researching kidney failure, transplant procedures, success rates, and recovery times. Not because I was considering helping Michael, but because I needed to understand exactly what he was facing, exactly how desperate his situation was. The medical facts were sobering. Without a transplant, Michael had maybe 6 months to live. Dialysis could extend that timeline somewhat, but his quality of life would deteriorate rapidly. A successful kidney transplant could give him 15 to 20 more years of healthy life. "Why are you researching this if you've already decided not to help?" David asked, finding me surrounded by medical journals and transplant statistics. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I need to understand the choice I'm making. If I say no, I need to be certain it's because I genuinely don't want to help, not because I'm afraid of facing him." "And what have you figured out?" "That I'm still that 11-year-old girl who wants her father to explain why she wasn't worth keeping." David sat down beside me, taking my hands in his. "What would you tell a patient in this situation? If someone came to you with a family member who'd hurt them but needed medical help, what would you advise?" "I'd tell them that forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. That they need to consider their own emotional well-being alongside the medical facts. That saving someone's life doesn't erase the harm they caused." "Good advice. Are you ready to take it?" 3 weeks later, I flew to Portland to meet with Dr. Huang and to see Michael for the first time in 8 years. Portland General Hospital looked exactly like the kind of place my mother had worked before she died. Sterile, efficient, and filled with people whose stories you'd never fully understand. I stood in the parking garage for 15 minutes after arriving, gripping my rental car keys and trying to decide whether I was making the biggest mistake of my adult life. Dr. Huang met me in her office first, going over the medical details with the clinical precision I'd learned to appreciate during my own training. Michael's kidneys had been failing for months, probably due to undiagnosed diabetes that he'd ignored until it was too late for conservative treatment. "Has he been compliant with dialysis?" I asked, reviewing his chart. "Moderately. He misses appointments sometimes, especially since his wife left. I think he's struggling with depression, which is common in kidney failure patients." Depression. As if abandoning an 11-year-old daughter was something that just happened to him, rather than a choice he'd made deliberately. "Dr. Martinez," Dr. Huang said gently, "I want you to know that you're under no obligation here. Directed donation requires genuine consent from the donor, and if you have reservations about this situation, we can refer Mr. Patterson to the general transplant waiting list." "What are his chances on the waiting list?" "Honestly, not great. He's 54, diabetic, and his blood type is relatively rare. Average wait time would be 4 to 5 years, assuming his condition doesn't deteriorate first. So basically, I was his only realistic chance for survival. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter he'd thrown away was literally his lifeline. Michael's hospital room was on the 7th floor overlooking the Willamette River. When I walked in, my first thought was how small he looked. The man who'd once seemed so powerful, so capable of controlling my entire world, was now thin and grey, connected to tubes and monitors that tracked his failing body. He looked up when I entered, and I saw recognition flash across his face, followed immediately by shame. For a long moment we just stared at each other, him lying in the hospital bed, me standing in the doorway wearing my white coat, and the confidence that 8 years of independence had built. "Sophia," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "you came." "Dr. Martinez," I corrected, "and I came to get information, not to have a reunion." He flinched at the coldness in my voice, but nodded. "I understand. I know I have no right to ask anything of you." "You're right, you don't." I sat down in the visitor's chair, maintaining the same professional demeanor I used with difficult patients. "Dr. Huang says you need a kidney transplant. She also says you listed me as your emergency contact, which is interesting since you haven't spoken to me in 8 years. I know how this looks. How this looks. Michael, you dropped me at a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve because your wife didn't want to deal with someone else's child. You ignored my letters, blocked my phone calls, and let me believe I was worthless enough to throw away. Now you're dying and suddenly I'm family again." The monitors around his bed beeped steadily as he absorbed my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was a coward. Rebecca gave me an ultimatum, and I chose the easy path instead of fighting for you. Every day since then, I've regretted it. Regret doesn't erase 8 years of abandonment. No, it doesn't. But Sophia, you have to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done. I loved you like you were my own daughter. If you loved me, you wouldn't have abandoned me. If I loved you, I would have been stronger. I would have fought for you instead of taking the coward's way out. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but all I saw was genuine remorse. It didn't change what he'd done, but it complicated my anger in ways I hadn't expected. "Tell me about the last 8 years," I said. "Tell me about your perfect family." Michael's expression crumpled. It wasn't perfect. It was never perfect. Rebecca filed for divorce 6 months ago when she found out I'd been sending money to Mercy House every month since you aged out of the system. That stopped me cold. "What?" "I've been donating to the shelter since you turned 18. I couldn't contact you directly. Rebecca made me promise never to try, but I could make sure the place that took care of you when I couldn't was properly funded." "You've been donating to Mercy House for 6 years?" "Anonymously. Mrs. Rodriguez probably thinks it's just a generous benefactor, but I've covered maintenance repairs, educational supplies, even helped fund their college scholarship program." I didn't know how to process this information. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it suggested that I hadn't been as completely forgotten as I'd believed. "What about your son? What about James?" Michael's face went pale. "He doesn't know about you." Rebecca insisted that we never tell him, that it would confuse him or make him feel insecure about his place in our family. But when the doctors said I needed family for donor testing, I had to tell him the truth. And how did he react? He was devastated, not just about having a sister he'd never known about, but about what kind of man his father really was. He's been staying with Rebecca since she moved out. He'll barely speak to me. So the perfect family had imploded, destroyed by the same secrets and selfishness that had destroyed mine 8 years earlier. I should have felt vindicated, but instead I felt sad for a 16-year-old boy whose world had just been shattered by adult dishonesty. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not ask James to be tested?" "He's 16 and he's not a match anyway. Different blood type. The doctors tested him first before we had to explain about you." "So I'm literally your last option." "Yes, but Sophia, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you. I know I forfeited any claim to your help when I abandoned you. If you say no, I'll understand, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to repair the damage I did to James." I sat there looking at this man who'd shaped my entire adult life through his absence, trying to figure out what I owed him, what I owed myself, and what I owed the scared little girl inside me who still wondered why she hadn't been worth fighting for. "I need to see your son," I said finally. "Before I make any decisions, I need to meet James." "He's staying with Rebecca, but I can ask." "No, I'll contact him myself. If I'm going to consider saving your life, I need to understand who else will be affected by my decision." That evening, I sat in my hotel room and found James Patterson on Facebook. His profile showed a serious-looking teenager with Michael's dark hair and Rebecca's delicate features. He was tagged in photos from school events, family vacations, birthday celebrations, all the normal teenage experiences I'd missed due to Michael's choices. I sent him a message introducing myself and asking if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. He responded within an hour. "I've been wanting to meet you since I found out you existed. My mum says I shouldn't get involved, but I need to understand what really happened." We met the next morning at a coffee shop near his high school. James was tall for 16, with intelligent eyes and a nervous energy that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. He arrived carrying a folder of printed documents, approaching our meeting with the same methodical preparation I would have used. "I researched you," he said without preamble, sitting down across from me. "Graduated medical school at 26, neurology resident at UCSF, published 3 papers on neurological trauma recovery. You became a doctor even though you were homeless as a kid. Where did you find all that information? Medical journal databases, hospital websites, conference programs. I've been learning about my sister for the past 3 weeks. Sister. He said it so naturally, as if my existence had always been part of his understanding of family. James, what do you know about why I ended up at Mercy House? His jaw tightened. I know that my dad chose my mom's comfort over your safety. I know that he let you believe you weren't worth keeping. And I know that my whole childhood was built on a lie about what kind of man my father really was. I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way. Are you going to save him? The question was so direct, so painfully honest, that I had to take a moment before answering. I don't know. What do you think I should do? James stared into his coffee cup for a long time. I think you should save him if you can live with saving him, and let him die if you can live with letting him die. But I don't think you should base the decision on whether he deserves it, because people don't get organs based on merit. That's very wise for a 16-year-old. I've had 3 weeks to think about it. Also, I've been reading about medical ethics since I found out what was happening. What would you do if you were in my position? James looked up at me with eyes that held too much pain for someone his age. I'd probably save him. Not because I forgave him, and not because I thought he deserved it, but because letting someone die when you could prevent it changes who you are. And you've worked too hard to become who you are to let his mistakes change you into someone else. That night, I called David and told him about my conversations with both Michael and James. What's your gut telling you? He asked. That I can save his life, but I'll never understand why he threw mine away. And is that enough? Can you live with saving him without getting the closure you need? I thought about that question for a long time. Maybe saving him is its own kind of closure. Maybe proving that I can choose compassion even when he chose cruelty is the only victory I really need. 2 days later, I checked into Portland General Hospital for pre-surgical testing. The kidney donation surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 8 years and 10 months after Michael had dropped me at Mercy House. I'd chosen the date deliberately, wanting to mark the anniversary of his abandonment with an act of radical forgiveness, not for his sake but for mine. Dr. Susan Chen, no relation to Ms. Eleanor Chen, was the transplant surgeon, a woman in her 50s with steady hands and a no-nonsense approach to patient care. She'd performed over 300 kidney transplants and had a reputation for exceptional surgical outcomes. Dr. Martinez, she said during our pre-surgical consultation, I want to make sure you understand that directed donation to an estranged family member carries additional psychological risks. Have you considered counseling to process the emotional aspects of this decision? I've been in therapy for 6 months, I told her. My therapist agrees that I'm making this choice from a position of strength, not trauma. That was true. Dr. Rachel Park, the psychologist I'd been seeing since the initial phone call from Portland General, had helped me work through my motivations and expectations. We'd spent hours distinguishing between healthy forgiveness and self-destructive martyrdom, between choosing compassion and being manipulated by guilt. Why do you want to save him? Dr. Park had asked during one of our sessions. Because I can. Because having the power to save someone's life and choosing not to use it would change who I am in ways I don't want to be changed. And what do you expect in return? Nothing. That's the point. I'm not doing this to earn his love or to prove my worth or to make him acknowledge how badly he hurt me. I'm doing this because the woman I've become is capable of this kind of grace. The morning of the surgery, David flew up from San Francisco to be with me. James skipped school to be at the hospital, despite Rebecca's objections. Ms. Chen drove down from Seattle, where she'd moved after retiring from the library, to hold my hand during pre-op. You don't have to do this, David said one final time as they prepared to wheel me into surgery. Even now you can change your mind. I know, but I want to do this. I need to do this. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When I woke up in recovery, the first thing I saw was David's worried face hovering over mine, followed by James sitting in the corner chair reading a medical journal. How do you feel? David asked. Like someone removed one of my organs, I said groggily. How's Michael? The transplant was successful, said Dr. Chen, appearing at my bedside. Your kidney is functioning well. and his body is showing good acceptance so far. He'll need immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of his life, but barring complications, he should have 15 to 20 years of healthy life ahead of him. James looked up from his journal. He wanted me to tell you thank you. He was crying when they told him the surgery went well. Over the next few days, as I recovered in the hospital, I had time to reflect on what I'd done and why. The physical pain was manageable. Kidney donation is major surgery, but recovery is typically straightforward for healthy donors. The emotional complexity was harder to navigate. I'd saved the life of the man who'd abandoned me, but that didn't automatically heal the wounds his abandonment had created. I still felt angry about the 8 years I'd spent believing I was worthless. I still grieved for the relationship we'd never had and never would have. But underneath those feelings was a new sense of peace, as if I'd finally closed a chapter that had been hanging open for too long. Michael tried to visit me during my recovery, but I wasn't ready for that conversation. Instead, I asked James to serve as our intermediary, which gave me a chance to get to know my half-brother without the emotional landmines of dealing with Michael directly. James was remarkable, intelligent, thoughtful, and mature beyond his 16 years. He'd inherited Michael's analytical mind, but seemed to have avoided his character weaknesses. He asked insightful questions about my medical training and shared his own aspirations to study environmental science like David. I want to understand how the decisions we make today affect the world we'll inherit tomorrow, he said during one of our conversations. Climate change, environmental justice, sustainable development. These are the challenges my generation will have to solve. Have you considered the intersection between environmental health and medicine? I asked. There's growing research on how pollution and climate change affect neurological development in children. His eyes lit up. Could you send me some papers? I'm applying to colleges next year, and I want to focus on programs that would prepare me for that kind of interdisciplinary work. Mentoring James felt natural and healing in ways I hadn't expected. He was eager to learn, grateful for guidance, and completely uninterested in the drama surrounding his father's medical crisis. He treated me like the big sister he'd never known he had, and I found myself protective of his innocence and excited about his potential. 2 weeks after the surgery, I was cleared to return to San Francisco and my residency duties. James hugged me goodbye at the airport, promising to stay in touch and asking if he could visit during his spring break. You know, he said as we waited for my boarding call, my dad was an idiot to let you go, but I'm grateful he's getting a second chance because it means I get to have you as my sister. I'm grateful too, I realized and meant it. Michael sent a letter a month after the surgery, the first direct communication we'd had since that day in the hospital. It was handwritten on simple notebook paper, his usually confident handwriting shaky from his recent medical ordeal. Dear Sophia, it began. I know that saying thank you for what you did is completely inadequate. You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. I don't understand the depth of grace that motivated your decision, but I'm humbling grateful for it. The letter went on to acknowledge the pain he'd caused, to take full responsibility for his choices, and to express hope that someday we might be able to have a relationship based on who we were now, rather than what had happened in the past. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he wrote. I'm asking for the chance to become the kind of man who deserves to be your father, even if it's too late for me to actually be him. I kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. I needed more time to process what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with Michael going forward. 3 months later, James called to tell me that Rebecca had dropped her divorce proceedings and was going to family therapy with Michael. They were trying to rebuild their marriage on a foundation of honesty instead of secrets. How do you feel about that? I asked. Cautiously optimistic, he said. My mum was wrong to make my dad choose between his families, but my dad was wrong to let her make that choice for him. If they can both acknowledge their mistakes and do better going forward, maybe we can all heal from this. And how are things between you and Michael? Better. He's trying really hard to be honest with me about everything now, including how much he regrets what he did to you. It's awkward, but I think we're going to be okay. That spring, James did visit us in San Francisco for a week during his school break. He spent his days at UC Berkeley attending environmental science classes with David and his evenings at UCSF, learning about neurological research from me. He was intellectually curious, academically motivated, and surprisingly funny when he relaxed enough to show his personality. "I can see where you get your drive," David observed after James had spent an entire evening asking detailed questions about my research on traumatic brain injury recovery. "He has the same intensity you had when you were focused on medical school. Except he's had emotional support and financial stability his entire life," I pointed out. "He's driven by curiosity and passion, not survival and spite." "That's probably healthier." During James's visit, I received another letter from Michael. This one was different, shorter, more specific, and focused on practical rather than emotional considerations. "Sophia," he wrote, "I know you're not ready to talk directly, but I wanted you to know that I've established a college fund for James that includes money I had been setting aside for you for the past 8 years. It's not nearly enough to make up for what I failed to provide, but I want you to know that you were never forgotten, even when I was too weak to reach out to you." The letter included bank statements showing monthly deposits to an account labeled Sophia's Education Fund, dating back to 2015, when I would have been starting college. The total amount was substantial, enough to cover medical school tuition at a private university. "He's been saving money for you this whole time," James confirmed when I asked him about it. "Even when my mum forbade him from contacting you, he was setting aside money in case you ever needed it for education or emergencies." I stared at the bank statements, trying to reconcile them with my understanding of Michael's abandonment. He'd thrown me away, but he'd also been planning for my future. He'd ignored my letters, but he'd been financially supporting the shelter that housed me. He'd failed to fight for me when it mattered most, but he'd been fighting for me in smaller secret ways ever since. People, I was learning, were more complicated than the stories I told myself about them. By the end of James's visit, I'd made a decision about Michael. I wasn't ready for a relationship, and I might never be, but I was ready to acknowledge that his capacity for love and his capacity for cowardice could coexist in the same person. I could accept his gratitude for the kidney donation without forgiving his abandonment. I could maintain boundaries while still allowing for the possibility of future healing. When James returned to Portland, he carried with him a letter from me to Michael. Not a reconciliation, but an acknowledgement that we were both different people than we'd been 8 years earlier. "Thank you for the college fund," I wrote. "I don't need the money now, but I appreciate knowing that you thought of me during the years when I felt completely forgotten. I'm not ready to rebuild a relationship, but I'm no longer actively angry. Perhaps that's progress." 6 months later, James called to tell me that Michael's kidney was functioning perfectly and that the doctors expected his recovery to continue progressing well. "He wants you to know," James said, "that he thinks about you every day, not just because your kidney is keeping him alive, but because knowing what you've accomplished makes him proud to have played even a small part in your story." "And how do you feel about all of this?" I asked. "I feel like our family is complicated and damaged, but also resilient. I feel like you and I are going to be okay, whatever happens with my dad. And I feel incredibly lucky to have found out I have a sister who's brilliant and brave and kind enough to save the life of someone who hurt her." That night, lying in bed next to David, I realized that saving Michael's life had accomplished something I never expected. It had given me a brother I loved and respected. A relationship built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual admiration rather than shared trauma. Maybe that had been the real gift all along. 2 years after the kidney transplant, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely transformed. I was in my 4th year of neurology residency. David had completed his PhD and accepted a position with the Environmental Protection Agency, and we'd bought a small house in the Mission District that we'd slowly been renovating on weekends. James was finishing his senior year of high school and had been accepted to Stanford's environmental engineering program with a partial scholarship. He'd grown into a confident young man who maintained close relationships with both his parents and with David and me, navigating our complicated family dynamics with remarkable emotional intelligence. That's when I discovered I was pregnant. The pregnancy was planned. David and I had been talking about starting a family for months, but the timing felt surreal. Here I was, about to become a mother at 28, the same age my mother had been when she'd had me. The symmetry felt both meaningful and terrifying. "How do you feel about it?" asked Dr. Park during one of our now monthly therapy sessions. "Excited, terrified, grateful, completely overwhelmed," I said. "I don't have any model for what good parenting looks like. I'm going to have to figure it out as I go." "You have David's family. You have the relationship you're building with James. You have professional colleagues who are also parents. You're not as alone as you think." She was right. Carmen Rodriguez had immediately started knitting baby blankets when we shared the news, treating our pregnancy as if she were becoming a grandmother. David's siblings offered advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and enthusiastic support. Even Ms. Chen, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, had started sending care packages filled with parenting books and prenatal vitamins. The most unexpected response came from James, who called the day after we told him the news. "Sophia," he said, "I know this is probably weird, but I want you to know that I'm really excited to be an uncle, and if you want any help with babysitting or anything, I'm totally available." "James, you're 17 years old. You should be focused on your senior year and college preparation, not helping with my baby." "I want to help. You're my sister, and this baby is going to be my niece or nephew. I've never had a baby in the family before." His enthusiasm was infectious and healing. For the first time since learning I was pregnant, I started imagining what it would feel like to raise a child surrounded by people who chose to love them, who saw them as a blessing rather than a complication. The pregnancy progressed normally despite the long hours and physical demands of residency. My fellow residents were supportive, covering for me when morning sickness made it difficult to function, and my attending physicians were flexible about scheduling around prenatal appointments. Dr. Williams, my mentor and the chief of neurology, pulled me aside during my 7th month of pregnancy. "Sophia," she said, "I want to talk to you about your plans after residency. Have you thought about fellowship opportunities?" "Some. I've been interested in pediatric neurology, specifically working with children who've experienced trauma or abuse." "That makes sense given your background. There's a fellowship opening at UCSF next year in pediatric neurological rehabilitation. The program focuses on helping children recover from traumatic brain injuries while addressing the psychological trauma that often accompanies those injuries. The fellowship sounded perfect, combining my medical interests with my personal understanding of childhood trauma. It would mean one more year of training, but David was supportive, and the program offered better hours than traditional residency, which would be important as a new parent. "Would you be willing to write a recommendation?" I asked Dr. Williams. "I'd be honored to. You've been one of the most dedicated residents I've ever worked with, and your ability to connect with patients from difficult backgrounds is exceptional. This fellowship would be lucky to have you." That evening, I shared the news with David over dinner at our favorite restaurant. He was thrilled about both the fellowship opportunity and the chance to continue living in San Francisco while I completed my training. "What about after the fellowship?" he asked. "Have you thought about where you want to practice?" "I've actually been thinking about Portland," I said. "There's a need for pediatric neurologists in the Pacific Northwest, and it would mean being closer to James during his college years. Plus, I'd like our child to grow up knowing their uncle." David reached across the table and took my hand. "Portland sounds perfect. We could buy a house with a real yard, maybe get a dog, start building the kind of stable family life that both of us want for our kid." 6 weeks later, our daughter Elena was born after a relatively easy labor. She was perfect, healthy, alert, and beautiful in the way that all babies are beautiful to their parents. Holding her for the first time, I felt a love so fierce and protective that it was almost frightening. "She's going to be amazing," David whispered, as we admired our daughter in the hospital room. "She's going to grow up knowing she's wanted and loved and supported." James drove down from Portland to meet his niece when she was 3 days old. He'd brought a carefully researched car seat as a gift and had read several books on infant development to prepare for being an uncle. "She looks like you," he said, gently stroking Elena's tiny hand. Same dark hair, same serious expression. I think she's going to be brilliant like her mom. She's going to be whatever she wants to be, I said. That's the gift we're going to give her, the freedom to become herself without having to overcome abandonment or neglect or feeling unwanted. 6 months after Eleanor was born, I received a card in the mail with Portland General Hospital's return address. Inside was a note from Michael, written in his careful handwriting. Dear Sophia, it read, I heard through James that you've had a daughter. Congratulations on this wonderful blessing. I know you'll be an exceptional mother because you've overcome so much to become an exceptional woman. I pray that Elena grows up feeling as loved and valued as you deserve to feel. With gratitude and respect, Michael. The card included a savings bond made out to Eleanor Rodriguez for $1,000, a gift for the granddaughter he'd probably never meet, from the grandfather who'd forfeited the right to claim her. I wasn't sure how I felt about Michael's gesture. Part of me appreciated his acknowledgement of Eleanor's birth, but part of me resented his assumption that he had any place in her life, even peripherally. After discussing it with David and Dr. Park, I decided to put the savings bond away for Elena's future education and to let time determine whether Michael would ever be part of our family story. The Fellowship in Pediatric Neurological Rehabilitation turned out to be exactly what I'd hoped for professionally. I worked with children recovering from traumatic brain injuries, helping them regain cognitive and motor functions while supporting their families through the challenging rehabilitation process. The work was emotionally demanding but incredibly rewarding. Many of my young patients came from complicated family situations. Some had been injured in accidents caused by parental neglect. Others had been hurt by domestic violence, and a few had been abandoned by families who couldn't cope with their special needs. Working with these children felt like completing a circle, using my own experience with abandonment to help them heal and thrive despite their circumstances. You have a special gift with the kids who've been through trauma, observed Dr. Lisa Park, the fellowship director. They trust you in ways they don't trust other medical professionals. Have you considered developing expertise in the intersection between childhood trauma and neurological development? It was an intriguing suggestion. There was growing research showing that childhood trauma could actually change brain structure and function, affecting everything from memory formation to emotional regulation. Understanding these connections could lead to more effective treatments for children who'd experienced abuse or neglect. Eleanor turned 1 year old just as I was completing my fellowship year. She was walking, babbling constantly, and had developed a particular fascination with medical equipment whenever I brought her to the hospital for brief visits. David joked that she was destined to follow in her parents' footsteps, becoming either a doctor or an environmental scientist. Or she could become an artist or a teacher or anything else she wants to be, I reminded him. We're not going to project our career ambitions onto our daughter. Fair point, he said, but I think it's sweet that she's already interested in helping people. That summer, James graduated high school as valedictorian and delivered a commencement speech about the importance of family, both the family you're born into and the family you choose. He spoke eloquently about learning to forgive without forgetting, about building bridges across painful divides, and about the responsibility that comes with privilege. Some people, he said in his speech, face challenges that would break many of us. When we encounter those people, we have a choice. We can judge them for their circumstances, or we can learn from their strength. My sister taught me that resilience isn't just about surviving hardship. It's about using that survival to help others thrive. After the ceremony, James pulled me aside with tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said, for showing me what real strength looks like, for teaching me that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choosing to show up for each other. Thank you for being the brother I never knew I needed, I replied, for proving that good things can come from even the most complicated situations. That fall, David and I moved to Portland as planned. We bought a house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood with a big backyard and room for Eleanor to grow. I accepted a position at Oregon Health and Science University as an attending physician in pediatric neurology with a research focus on trauma-informed care. Ms. Chen moved back to Portland at the same time we did, wanting to be closer to us and Elena during her retirement years. She became Elena's honorary grandmother, teaching her to love books and asking thoughtful questions about everything around her. "That little girl is going to change the world," Ms. Chen said one afternoon as we watched Eleanor carefully examining flowers in our garden. "She has your curiosity and David's kindness. Whatever she chooses to do, she's going to make a difference." 2 years after moving to Portland, I ran into Mrs. Rodriguez at the grocery store. She'd aged considerably since I'd known her at Mercy House, but her eyes still held the same kindness and wisdom that had comforted so many children over the years. "Dr. Sophia," she exclaimed when she recognized me. "Look at you. Successful doctor, beautiful family. I always knew you were destined for great things." "You were one of the people who made it possible," I told her. "You kept me safe when I had nowhere else to go." "You kept yourself safe, honey. We just provided the roof." I learned that Mrs. Rodriguez had retired from social work but continued volunteering at Mercy House, helping current residents navigate the challenges of aging out of the system. She told me about the scholarship program that had been established with anonymous donations, the same program Michael had been quietly funding for years. "We've had 12 young people go on to college in the past 5 years," she said proudly. 3 are studying medicine, 2 are in engineering programs, and 1 just graduated law school. That shelter may have been the worst thing that happened to you at the time, but look how many lives have been changed because of the support that came afterward. Driving home that day, I realized that my story had never been just about my own survival and success. It had been about creating ripple effects of healing and support that extended far beyond my individual experience. Michael's donations had helped other children avoid some of the struggles I'd faced. My success had inspired James to think about service and social responsibility. Elena would grow up understanding both privilege and resilience, hopefully using both to help others. That night, as I tucked Eleanor into her crib, I whispered the same promise I'd been making to her since the day she was born. "You are wanted. You are loved. You are safe. And you never have to earn your place in this family. It's yours by right, not by merit." She looked up at me with bright, curious eyes and smiled, completely secure in the knowledge that she was cherished. It was a security I'd had to build for myself as an adult, but she would have it from birth. And that felt like the greatest victory of all. Elena was 3 years old when I received the phone call that would force me to confront the final piece of unfinished business from my past. It was a Tuesday evening in early December, and I was reading bedtime stories when my phone rang with a familiar area code. "Dr. Rodriguez?" The voice was professional but shaky. "This is Sarah Kim from Portland General Hospital. I'm calling about Michael Patterson." My stomach dropped. "Is he okay?" "He's had a heart attack, a significant one. He's stable for now, but his prognosis is uncertain. He's been asking for you." I sat down heavily on Elena's bed, my mind racing. Michael's kidney transplant had been successful. His labs had been normal at his last checkup just 3 months earlier. But transplant recipients face increased risks for cardiovascular disease due to their immunosuppressive medications. "How bad is it?" I asked. "He's in the cardiac ICU. The next 48 hours will be critical. Dr. Rodriguez, I need to ask, would you consider being listed as his medical power of attorney? He doesn't have anyone else who can make healthcare decisions if he becomes unable to communicate." The irony was staggering. The man who'd abandoned me was now asking me to hold his life in my hands for the second time, but this time making decisions about his care rather than providing organs for his survival. What about his wife, his son? Rebecca moved to Seattle 6 months ago. They're divorced now and she's remarried. James is at Stanford and he's only 19. Michael doesn't want to burden him with these kinds of medical decisions. I looked at Elena, who was patiently waiting for me to finish the phone call so we could continue her bedtime story. She was the same age I'd been when my mother died, the same age when my world first fell apart. The thought of her facing medical crises or difficult decisions at such a young age made my heart ache. "I'll come to the hospital," I said. but I'm not making any commitments beyond that. David insisted on coming with me, arranging for his mother to watch Eleanor overnight. The drive to Portland General was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what this meant for our family, for my peace of mind, for the boundaries I'd carefully constructed around my relationship with Michael. The cardiac ICU was dimly lit and filled with the steady beeping of monitors and ventilators. Michael looked smaller than I remembered from our last encounter 4 years earlier, grey-faced and connected to multiple machines. James sat beside the bed reading a textbook, having driven down from Stanford when he received the call. "Sophia," James said, standing to hug me. "Thank you for coming. I know this is complicated." "How is he?" "Conscious, but weak. The doctors say he needs surgery to clear blocked arteries, but it's high risk given his kidney situation. They need someone to make decisions if something goes wrong during the procedure." I approached Michael's bedside cautiously. His eyes were closed, but he opened them when he heard my voice. "Sophia," he said weakly, "you came." "James called me. He said you might need someone to make medical decisions." Michael nodded slightly. "I don't have anyone else I trust to make the right choices. Rebecca has her own life now, and I won't put James through this kind of responsibility." "Michael, I need to understand something. Why me? After everything that's happened, why would you want me making decisions about your care?" He was quiet for a long moment, gathering strength to speak. "Because you understand medicine. Because you understand what quality of life means versus just staying alive. And because if anyone has the right to decide whether my life is worth saving, it's you." The weight of that statement settled over me. Michael was essentially giving me permission to choose whether he lived or died, trusting my medical judgment and moral compass in ways he'd never trusted my worth as his daughter. Dr. Martinez, the cardiologist, no relation despite the shared surname, explained Michael's situation in detail. The heart attack had been caused by severe blockages in 2 major arteries. Surgical intervention could restore blood flow and potentially give him several more years of life, but the procedure carried significant risks for someone with kidney disease and his overall medical history. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "If this were my father, I'd recommend the surgery. The risks are real, but without intervention, he's looking at maybe 6 months of declining quality of life followed by heart failure. With successful surgery, he could have 5 to 10 good years." I spent that night in the hospital family lounge, reviewing Michael's medical records and consulting with his treatment team. David sat with me, offering quiet support while I wrestled with a decision I'd never imagined having to make. "What's your gut telling you?" David asked around 3 a.m. as we shared terrible hospital coffee. "That I should authorize the surgery, not because I've forgiven him, or because I think he deserves more time, but because the medical evidence suggests it's the right choice for his condition." "And emotionally? How do you feel about potentially losing him now, when you've just started to process your relationship?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. Despite everything Michael had done, despite the years of abandonment and the pain he'd caused, I realized I wasn't ready for him to die. Not because I loved him, but because there were still conversations we hadn't had, still possibilities for understanding that hadn't been explored. The next morning, I signed the consent forms authorizing Michael's cardiac surgery. James held my hand as we waited during the 4-hour procedure, both of us anxious about the outcome despite our complicated feelings about the patient. The surgery was successful. Dr. Martinez emerged from the operating room with good news. They'd cleared the blockages, Michael's heart was responding well, and his kidney function had remained stable throughout the procedure. "He's going to need cardiac rehabilitation and ongoing monitoring," Dr. Martinez explained, "but this should give him several more years of good quality life." 2 days later, Michael was awake and stable enough for a real conversation. I found him sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better despite the surgical incisions and lingering weakness. "Thank you," he said when I walked in, "for agreeing to the surgery, for making that choice when I couldn't. It was the medically appropriate decision. Any cardiologist would have recommended the same thing. But any cardiologist wouldn't have understood what my life was worth to the people I've hurt. You could have let me die, and no one would have blamed you for it." I sat down in the visitor's chair, studying his face. Michael, I need you to understand something. I didn't save your life because I've forgiven you or because I think you deserve it. I saved your life because letting you die when I could prevent it would have changed who I am. And I like who I am now. He nodded slowly. I understand. And I want you to know that I don't expect anything more from you. Not a relationship, not forgiveness, not even friendship. But I hope you'll let me know your daughter as she grows up. Not as her grandfather, but maybe as James's father who's grateful to her mother. The request was carefully worded, acknowledging boundaries while expressing hope for connection. It was the kind of mature communication that Michael had been incapable of 8 years earlier, and it suggested genuine change rather than manipulation. I need to think about it, I said. Eleanor's well-being is my priority, and I won't expose her to anything that might hurt her or confuse her about family relationships. Of course, whatever you decide, I'll respect. That evening, James and I had dinner together while David stayed at the hotel with Elena, who'd been cranky all day and needed some downtime. How are you processing all of this? I asked James as we shared pizza at a restaurant near the hospital. It's strange, he admitted. Part of me is relieved that he's going to be okay, but part of me is angry that you've had to deal with this stress. You shouldn't have to be responsible for his healthcare decisions. But I was the right person to make them. I understood the medical complexities, and I could be objective about his prognosis without being overwhelmed by emotion. Still, it's not fair that he keeps needing you to save him when he wasn't there to save you. James's protective anger on my behalf was touching and healing. It felt good to have someone recognize the unfairness of the situation while still supporting my decisions. James, what kind of relationship do you think Elena should have with Michael, if any? I think she should know the truth about our family history when she's old enough to understand it, but I also think she should get to decide for herself whether she wants a relationship with him. Kids deserve honesty about their family, even when that family is complicated. 3 weeks later, Michael was discharged to a cardiac rehabilitation program. He'd be staying temporarily with James, who was on winter break from Stanford. The arrangement would give them time to continue rebuilding their relationship while ensuring Michael had support during his recovery. Before we left Portland to return to our normal lives, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I agreed to let Michael meet Eleanor. The meeting took place at James's apartment, with David and me present to supervise, and Eleanor free to interact or not interact as she chose. Michael sat quietly on the couch while Eleanor played with her toys, occasionally glancing at him with the open curiosity that 3-year-olds have for new people. Elena, I said gently, this is James's dad, Michael. He wanted to meet you. Eleanor looked at Michael seriously for a moment, then walked over and offered him one of her toy cars. Do you like cars? She asked. I do like cars, Michael said softly, accepting the toy. This is a beautiful car. What color is it? Blue! It's my favorite blue car. Uncle James says blue cars go fastest. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor and Michael had a perfectly ordinary conversation about cars, colors, and whether elephants could drive trucks. Michael followed her lead completely, engaging with her interests without trying to establish any special connection or claim any particular role in her life. When it was time to go, Eleanor hugged everyone goodbye, including Michael, with the same casual affection she showed to new acquaintances she liked. She's beautiful, Michael told me as we prepared to leave. You're raising an amazing little girl. Thank you. And Michael? The fact that you let her set the pace, that you didn't try to force any kind of relationship or claim any special status. That meant a lot to me. 6 months later, I received a card for Eleanor's birthday with a modest gift. A children's book about doctors helping people. The inscription read, "For Eleanor, who has a brilliant mother and wonderful uncle who love her very much. Happy 4th birthday. Michael." It was appropriate, thoughtful, and carefully boundaried. I added it to Eleanor's bookshelf and made a mental note to send a thank you card, the kind of polite acknowledgement you'd send to any family acquaintance. That summer, James graduated from Stanford with honors and was accepted to graduate school at the University of Washington for environmental engineering. During his graduation celebration, He pulled me aside with a question that had been on his mind. Sophia, do you think people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding who they always were? Why do you ask? Because my dad seems different now. More thoughtful, more honest about his mistakes, more aware of how his choices affect other people. But I wonder if that's real change or just the result of almost dying twice. I considered his question carefully. I think people can change, but usually only after facing consequences that force them to examine their choices. Your dad has had to live with the reality of what he lost when he abandoned me. He's had to face his mortality twice. That kind of reckoning can motivate genuine transformation, but it doesn't erase the harm that was done. So you think he's really changed? I think he's changing. Whether that change is permanent or sustainable, only time will tell. But James, whether he changes or not, doesn't affect your worth or your choices. You get to decide what kind of relationship you want with him based on how he treats you now, not on what he might become or what he used to be. James nodded thoughtfully. I love him, but I also love you and Elena. If he ever does anything to hurt you again, I need you to know that I'll choose you. Family loyalty goes to the people who show up, not just to the people who share DNA. His words filled me with gratitude and pride. At 20, James had developed the kind of emotional intelligence and moral clarity that some people never achieve. He understood that love requires action, not just feeling, and that family bonds are strengthened by choice, not just blood. That evening, as David and I watched Elena play in our backyard, I reflected on how much had changed since that phone call about Michael's kidney failure 5 years earlier. I'd gone from someone defined by abandonment to someone surrounded by chosen family. Eleanor was growing up in a world of unconditional love and support. James had become not just my brother, but one of my closest friends and most trusted confidants. And Michael? Michael remained a complex figure in our story. Not a villain anymore, but not exactly family either. He existed in a space somewhere between stranger and relative, someone whose life I'd saved, but whose love I'd learned to live without. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps some relationships aren't meant to be fully healed or completely severed, but simply held in a space of cautious peace. As I watched Elena chase butterflies in our garden, laughing with the pure joy that comes from feeling completely secure in your place in the world, I knew that breaking the cycle of abandonment had been the most important work of my life. Whatever happened with Michael, whatever challenges lay ahead, Elena would never question whether she was wanted. And that felt like victory enough. 5 years had passed since Michael's heart attack, when I received news that would forever change how I understood our complicated family story. Elena was 8 years old, thriving in 3rd grade, and had recently announced her intention to become either a veterinarian or a marine biologist, depending on whether she decided she loved animals more on land or in the ocean. The call came on a Saturday morning while I was making pancakes and Elena was building elaborate structures with her Legos at the kitchen table. James's name appeared on my phone, but when I answered, his voice was tight with emotion. "Sophia," he said. "I need to tell you something about Dad, something I just found out that changes everything we thought we knew." I set down the pancake batter and stepped into the living room where David was reading the newspaper. "What's wrong? Is Michael okay?" "He's fine, physically. But Sophia, I found some letters yesterday when I was helping him organize his files for his will. Letters from you that he kept. All of them." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "The letters you sent him when you were at Mercy House. He kept every single one. And there are letters he wrote back to you but never sent. Dozens of them." I sank into the nearest chair, my mind reeling. "James, that doesn't make sense. None of my letters came back. If he kept them, why didn't he respond?" "Because Rebecca found them. There's a whole file folder documenting everything. Your letters, his unsent responses, and correspondence between him and Rebecca about what to do about your attempts to contact him." David looked up from his newspaper, sensing the gravity of the conversation. He moved closer, taking my free hand while I continued listening to James. "Sophia, Rebecca was intercepting your letters and forbidding him from responding. She told him that responding would just give you false hope. that clean breaks were better for children, that contact would confuse you and prevent you from bonding with a potential foster family. I felt like I was drowning. 8 years of believing I'd been ignored, of thinking my carefully written letters had been thrown away unread, of concluding that Michael simply didn't care enough to respond. Did he try to fight her on it? James's voice was heavy with sadness. The letters he wrote but never sent suggest he wanted to respond. He wrote about missing you, about regretting the decision to leave you at the shelter, about wanting to know how you were doing in school. But ultimately, he went along with Rebecca's decision because he believed it was better for you. Better for me? The anger in my voice surprised even me. Better for me to believe I was completely forgotten? Better for me to think I wasn't worth a single response? I know it was wrong. But Sophia, there's something else. The anonymous donations to Mercy House, they started 3 months after you arrived there. He's been supporting that shelter since you were 12 years old. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to process this information. Everything I thought I knew about my abandonment was being rewritten in real time. James, where is Michael now? I need to see these letters. He's at my apartment. He wanted me to call you first, to prepare you for what you'd find. He said he knows this doesn't excuse what he did, but he wanted you to understand that you were never forgotten. You were never unloved. 2 hours later, David and Eleanor came with me to James's apartment in northwest Portland. Eleanor, who had no understanding of the emotional significance of this visit, brought a colouring book to keep herself busy while the adults talked. Michael was sitting at James's kitchen table with a large cardboard box in front of him. When I walked in, he looked up with eyes that held 2 decades of regret and exhaustion. Sophia, he said quietly, I know this is a shock. I should have told you about the letters years ago. I sat across from him, noting how much he'd aged since his heart surgery. At 61, he looked fragile in ways that weren't entirely explained by his medical history. Show me, I said simply. The first letter I pulled from the box was written in my 11-year-old handwriting on lined notebook paper. Dear Michael, it began. I hope you and Rebecca and the baby are doing well. I'm learning a lot at the shelter and my grades are good. Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm doing better than most kids my age with adjusting. I miss you and I hope I can come home soon. Love, Sophia. Reading my own words from 17 years earlier was like looking through a window into the heart of that abandoned child. The hope in that letter, the assumption that my exile was temporary, the desperate attempt to prove I was worth keeping. It broke something inside me that I thought had already been broken and healed. You kept this, I whispered. I kept all of them. 43 letters over 2 years until you finally stopped writing. Michael handed me a different piece of paper, his response to that first letter, written in his familiar handwriting, but yellowed with age. Dear Sophia, it read, your letter brought tears to my eyes. I'm so proud of your good grades and how well you're adjusting to your new environment. I miss you terribly and think about you every day. I made a terrible mistake in leaving you at the shelter, and I'm working on finding a way to bring you home. Rebecca needs time to adjust to being a new mother, but I believe we can all be a family together eventually. Please be patient with me while I figure out how to fix what I've broken. All my love, Michael. I stared at the letter, dated just 1 week after my first letter to him. Why didn't you send this? Michael's voice was barely audible. Rebecca found it before I could mail it. She convinced me that responding would give you false hope, that maintaining contact would prevent you from forming attachments in foster care. She said clean breaks were kinder in the long run. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her because believing her was easier than fighting for you. I was a coward, Sophia. I chose the path of least resistance rather than doing what I knew was right. I pulled out more letters, both mine and his unsent responses. The pattern was heartbreaking. My letters growing shorter and more formal as months passed, his responses growing more desperate and regretful as he realized what he'd lost. My final letter, sent when I was 13, was just 3 sentences. Dear Michael, I hope you're happy with your new family. I'm doing well and don't need anything. Please don't worry about me anymore. Michael's unsent response to that letter was 6 pages long, filled with apologies, explanations, and promises he wasn't able to keep. Eleanor, who had been quietly colouring at the other end of the table, looked up at the adults around her. "Mama, why are you crying?" I realised tears were streaming down my face as I read through this documentation of mutual loss and misunderstanding. "I'm sad about something that happened a long time ago, sweetheart. But I'm also happy that I finally understand what really happened." David moved behind my chair and placed his hands on my shoulders, providing grounding support as I processed this revelation. "Michael," I said finally, "this doesn't excuse what you did. You still chose to abandon me. You still let Rebecca make decisions about your relationship with me. You still failed to fight for me when I needed you most." "I know," he said. "I know that my intentions don't matter as much as my actions. I know that you suffered because of my cowardice, and that suffering shaped your entire childhood and adolescence. But it also helps me understand something I've wondered about for years. I always wondered if you'd gotten my letters and simply didn't care enough to respond. Learning that you cared but were too weak to act is different. Still painful, but different." James had been quietly listening to this conversation. "What do you need from him now?" he asked me. "What would help you process this information?" I looked at Michael, trying to see him clearly for perhaps the first time in our complicated relationship. He wasn't the villain I'd constructed in my imagination, but he also wasn't the father I'd needed him to be. He was simply a flawed human being who'd made cowardly choices that hurt a child who loved him. "I need you to understand," I said to Michael, "that learning about these letters doesn't erase the damage that was done. I still spent years believing I was worthless, still struggled with abandonment issues, still had to build my entire identity around surviving your rejection. I understand, and I take full responsibility for that damage. But it also means that the foundation of our relationship wasn't complete indifference. You did love me, even if you were too weak to show it." Michael nodded, tears in his own eyes now. "I loved you then, and I love you now. I love the remarkable woman you became despite my failures. I love watching you raise Elena with the kind of strength and devotion I should have shown you. What I need from you now," I continued, "is honesty about our relationship going forward. I'm not your daughter in any meaningful sense. David and Eleanor and James and Ms. Chen are my real family. But you're not a stranger either. You're someone who loved me imperfectly and hurt me significantly. And you're also James's father, and someone whose life I've saved twice. What does that make me to you?" I considered the question carefully. It makes you someone I can care about without depending on, someone I can forgive without forgetting, someone who can be part of our extended story without being central to our daily lives. Elena looked up from her colouring book again. "Are you talking about family?" she asked with the directness that children bring to adult conversations. "We are, sweetheart. We're talking about how families can be complicated and how people can love each other in different ways. Like how Uncle James is your brother but not Daddy's brother, but we all love him anyway." Exactly like that. That evening, after we'd returned home and Eleanor was in bed, David and I sat on our back porch discussing what we'd learned and what it might mean for our family moving forward. "How are you feeling about everything?" David asked. "Oddly relieved," I said. For 17 years, I believed that my own father could abandon me so easily because I wasn't worth fighting for. Learning that he struggled with the decision, that he regretted it immediately, that he wanted to bring me home. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes what it means. You were always worth fighting for, but I understand why knowing he thought so too would matter. 3 months later, Michael asked if he could attend Eleanor's elementary school graduation from 3rd grade. It was a small ceremony, just parents and grandparents celebrating the transition to 4th grade, but Eleanor had specifically requested that Uncle James come from Seattle to watch her receive her Academic Achievement Award. "Can Michael come too?" I asked Elena. "James might bring his dad with him." Elena considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "Is he nice to you now?" "He's learning to be kind. He made some mistakes when I was little, but he's trying to do better." "Then he can come, but he's not my grandpa. I already have Grandma Carmen and Grandpa Rodriguez and Great-Grandma Chen. That's exactly right, sweetheart. He's just James's dad who wants to celebrate how smart you are. Michael sat quietly in the back row during Elena's graduation, taking photos only when invited to do so and maintaining appropriate boundaries throughout the ceremony. When Elena ran up afterward with her certificate, she showed it to everyone equally: her parents, her uncle, her grandparents, and the man she knew simply as James's dad, who has the same kidney as Mama. Later, as we all gathered for ice cream to celebrate Elena's achievement, I watched Michael interacting with our extended family. He spoke respectfully with Carmen Rodriguez about Elena's academic progress, thanked Ms. Chen for her role in my education, and praised James for his environmental advocacy work in Seattle. "Thank you," he said to me as the celebration was winding down, "for letting me be part of this, for letting me see how beautiful your life has become. Thank you for respecting the boundaries and for letting Elena set the terms of your relationship." As we drove home that evening, Eleanor chatted excitedly about starting 4th grade and about the science fair project she was already planning. In the rearview mirror, I watched James's car following us home, knowing that Michael was riding beside his son, probably processing his own emotions about witnessing the family celebration. "Do you think James's dad is lonely?" Elena asked from her car seat. "Why do you ask?" "He seemed sad today, even though it was a happy day." My 8-year-old daughter's emotional intelligence continued to amaze me. "I think he is lonely sometimes. He made some choices when he was younger that meant he missed out on having a big, close family like ours." "That's sad, but at least he has Uncle James." "Yes, at least he has James." That night, as I tucked Eleanor into bed, she asked the question that had been building all day. "Mama, why didn't James's dad take care of you when you were little like I am now?" I had been preparing for this conversation for months, knowing that Eleanor was old enough to understand age-appropriate versions of our family story. When I was 11 years old, my mama died in a car accident. Michael had married my mama and promised to take care of me, but after she died, he married someone new who didn't want to take care of someone else's little girl. So he left me at a place where other adults could keep me safe until I grew up. "But why didn't you come live with him when you grew up?" "Because by then I had built my own family. I had Grandma Carmen and Uncle James, and eventually I met Daddy and we had you. Sometimes when people make mistakes, they can't be fixed. They can just be forgiven." "Do you forgive him?" "I'm learning to. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. It helps you stop carrying around anger that makes you sad." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the thoughtfulness she'd inherited from both her parents. "I'm glad you learned to make a good family for us," she said finally. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." As I turned off Elena's bedroom light and headed downstairs to rejoin David, I realized that the story I'd been telling myself about my childhood was finally complete. Not the fairy tale ending where the absent father returns and all wounds are healed, but the more complex narrative where understanding leads to peace rather than reconciliation. Michael would remain part of our extended story, James's father, the man whose kidney I shared, someone I could care about without needing him. Eleanor would grow up knowing the full truth of our family history when she was ready for it, understanding that families come in many forms and that love is demonstrated through action, not just intention. And I would continue to build the kind of life my 11-year-old self had dreamed of, one filled with chosen family, meaningful work, and the absolute security that comes from knowing you are valued exactly as you are. Some stories end with dramatic forgiveness and restored relationships. Others end with quiet understanding and peaceful coexistence. Both can be victories. Both can be healing. As David and I settled into our evening routine, I felt grateful for the messy, complicated, ultimately loving story that had led us to this moment. To our beautiful daughter sleeping safely upstairs. To our work that helped other people heal. To our extended family that chose each other daily. It wasn't the story I had planned, but it was better than anything I could have imagined. Today is Elena's 18th birthday, and she's been accepted to Stanford University to study marine biology with a minor in environmental justice. As I watch her blow out the candles on her birthday cake, surrounded by the family we've built together. I'm struck by how much has changed since that Christmas Eve when I was abandoned at 11 years old. James, now 30 and married to a brilliant environmental lawyer named Maria, serves as Elena's academic mentor and surrogate older brother. He's completed his PhD and works for the EPA, following David's footsteps in environmental protection while forging his own path in climate policy research. Ms. Chen, now 85 but still sharp as ever, sits at the head of our dinner table sharing stories about Eleanor's childhood that make everyone laugh. She moved into our guest house 3 years ago when living independently became challenging, and Eleanor considers her one of her closest confidants. Michael, now 68 and in surprisingly good health despite his medical history, sent a thoughtful graduation gift. A marine biology textbook signed by a renowned ocean researcher he'd somehow tracked down. He maintains respectful boundaries while staying connected to our family celebrations through James. "Speech, speech!" James calls out as Elena finishes opening her gifts. Elena stands up, suddenly looking very adult despite her 18 years. "I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped make this day possible. Mom and Dad, for showing me that families are built on choice and love, not just biology. Uncle James, for proving that siblings don't have to share parents to share everything else. Great-Grandma Chen, for teaching me that wisdom comes from listening and that kindness is the most important curriculum." She pauses, looking around the table at the faces that have shaped her understanding of love and belonging. "And thank you for teaching me that every family story is complicated, but that doesn't make the love any less real. I'm proud to be a Rodriguez, and I'm excited to carry our family values into whatever comes next." As I listen to my daughter's words, I realize that the greatest victory of my life wasn't becoming a successful doctor or saving Michael's life or even finding love with David. The greatest victory was breaking the cycle of abandonment, creating a family built on unconditional acceptance, and raising a daughter who knows with absolute certainty that she is wanted, valued, and loved. Elena will never question her place in our family, because that place was secured before she was born and reinforced every day of her life. She'll face her own challenges and make her own mistakes, but she'll face them from a foundation of security that I had to build for myself as an adult. Later that evening, as David and I clean up from the party, I find a card Elena left for me on the kitchen counter. Inside, she's written, "Mum, thank you for showing me what it looks like to choose love over fear, forgiveness over bitterness, and family over blood. I'm proud to be your daughter, and I hope to parent my own children someday with the same strength and grace you've shown me. Sometimes the most important gifts we give our children are the ones they don't fully understand until they're adults themselves." Elena will carry forward the lessons about resilience, compassion, and the importance of chosen family that shaped our household. She'll know that love requires action, that forgiveness is a choice, and that the families we build are often stronger than the ones we're born into. As I turn off the lights and head upstairs to where David is already reading in bed, I think about the 11-year-old girl sitting in that homeless shelter on Christmas Eve, wondering if anyone would ever choose to keep her. I wish I could go back and tell her that not only would she be chosen, but she would learn to choose others. A husband who would become her best friend, a daughter who would fill their home with laughter, a brother who would prove that family bonds transcend genetics, and an elderly librarian who would become the grandmother she'd never had. I'd tell her that the abandonment she was experiencing would shape her into someone who never abandoned others, that the pain she was feeling would develop into compassion for other people's suffering, and that the fear of being unwanted would transform into a fierce commitment to making everyone in her life feel valued. Most importantly, I'd tell her that she was never really alone, even when it felt like the world had forgotten her. Love was coming, not from the people who should have provided it, but from the people who would choose to provide it. And that kind of love, the kind that's freely given rather than biologically obligated, would prove to be the strongest foundation she could build her life upon. The phone rings as I'm getting ready for bed, and I see James's name on the caller ID. "Just wanted to say thank you for including me in Eleanor's celebration today," he says. and to tell you that my dad asked me to express his gratitude for letting him be part of her life, even in a small way. James, you don't need to thank me for including you in family celebrations. You're not a guest in our lives. You're a permanent resident. I know, but I also know that it would have been easier for you to keep me at a distance because of everything that happened with my dad. The fact that you chose to build a relationship with me despite that history means everything. After we hang up, I realize that James represents the unexpected gift that came from the worst thing that ever happened to me. Michael's abandonment led directly to my relationship with James, which has been one of the most meaningful connections in my adult life. The brother I gained was worth more than the father I lost. Sometimes the most devastating events in our lives clear the path for something better than what we originally lost. Sometimes being forced to build our own families leads us to create stronger bonds than the ones we were born into. As I finally settle into bed next to David, who's fallen asleep with a book about climate policy open on his chest, I feel profoundly grateful for the life we've built together. Not just the successes and celebrations, but the quiet daily choices to show up for each other, to prioritize kindness over convenience, and to create the kind of home where everyone feels safe to be exactly who they are. Tomorrow, Elena will start packing for college, beginning her own journey of independence and self-discovery. But unlike my departure into adulthood, hers will happen from a foundation of love and support that will follow her wherever she goes. She'll call when she's homesick, and we'll listen. She'll come home for holidays, and we'll celebrate. She'll bring friends and eventually romantic partners to meet us, and we'll welcome them. She'll make mistakes, and we'll help her learn from them. She'll achieve successes, and we'll cheer her on. Most importantly, she'll know that no matter how far she travels or how much she changes, she'll always have a home with us. Not because she's our biological child, but because we chose her before she was born and will continue choosing her every day of our lives. That's the gift I never received but learned to give. That's the cycle I broke and replaced with something better. And that, more than any professional achievement or personal victory, feels like the most important work I've ever done. The kidney I gave Michael kept his body alive for 15 additional years. The love I gave Elena will keep her spirit strong for the rest of her life. Both were acts of grace, but only one will continue growing long after I'm gone, spreading through the family she'll build, and the children she'll raise and the love she'll choose to give to people who need it most. In the end, that's the legacy that matters. Not the suffering we endured, but the love we learned to create in spite of it.